The Whistling Man. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, curses, they were all just stories to me. Campfire tales meant to scare kids or entertain bored adults. But that was before I moved to Black Hollow. Before I met the Whistling Man. Black Hollow is one of those forgotten towns you only find if you take a wrong turn on a back road. It's nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by dense pines that seem to swallow the sunlight. The town itself is small, with a population of maybe 200 people. Most of them are elderly, and they all have this look in their eyes, like they've seen too much and are just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. I moved there because of a job. I'm a freelance writer, and I'd been hired to document the history of the town for some obscure travel blog. The pay was decent, and the idea of spending a few months in a quiet, secluded place sounded appealing. I rented a small cabin on the edge of the woods, far enough from the town to feel isolated, but close enough to walk in if I needed supplies. The first week was uneventful. I spent my days interviewing locals and exploring the town. The people were polite but distant, and they always seemed to change the subject whenever I asked about the woods. Nothing good comes from those trees. One old man told me, his voice trembling, "You'd do well to stay away." I didn't listen, of course. I'm not the kind of person who takes warnings seriously. So, one evening, after finishing up my work for the day, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was cool and crisp. It was peaceful at first. That's when I heard it. A faint whistling sound drifting through the trees. It was a tune I didn't recognize, slow and mournful, like a lullaby played at a funeral. I stopped walking and listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once, echoing through the woods in a way that made my skin crawl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and weak in the vast emptiness of the forest. The whistling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a soft chuckle. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I hurried back to my cabin, locking the door behind me and drawing the curtains. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just the woods playing tricks on me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the whistling. It was louder this time, closer, and it seemed to be coming from right outside my window. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife, listening to the whistling as it circled my cabin. It went on for hours, stopping only when the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The next morning, I went into town to ask about what I'd heard. The locals were reluctant to talk, but eventually, an elderly woman named Mrs. Grayson agreed to speak with me. Her face turned pale when I mentioned the whistling. "You've heard him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The whistling man." According to Mrs. Grayson, the whistling man was a local legend, a figure said to haunt the woods around Black Hollow. No one knew who he was or where he came from, but his presence was always preceded by that eerie whistling. Those who heard it were said to disappear soon after, their bodies never found. "He's drawn to outsiders," Mrs. Grayson warned. "People who don't belong here. You should leave while you still can." I laughed it off, of course. I didn't believe in ghost stories, and I wasn't about to let some silly legend scare me away from my job. But as the days went on, the whistling became more frequent. I heard it during the day, when I was out walking, and at night, when I was trying to sleep. It was always the same tune, slow and haunting, and it always seemed to be just out of sight. Then, one night, I saw him. I was sitting at my desk, typing up my notes, when I heard the whistling again. It was louder than ever, and it seemed to be coming from right outside my door. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate, telling myself it was probably just some animal or a trick of the wind. I opened the door, and there he was. He was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to bend in ways that shouldn't be possible. His skin was pale and cracked, like old parchment, and his face was blank, featureless except for a wide, gaping mouth. He was whistling that same, haunting tune, the sound echoing through the night. I froze, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. He tilted his head, as if studying me, and then he stepped forward. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the key. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for him to burst through. But he didn't. Instead, the whistling started again, this time from the other side of the cabin. I ran to the window and saw him standing there, his blank face pressed against the glass. He was smiling now, a grotesque, toothless grin that made my stomach churn. I spent the rest of the night barricaded in my bedroom, listening to the whistling as it moved around the cabin. It didn't stop until morning, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. The next day, I decided to dig deeper into the legend of the whistling man. I visited the town's tiny library, a dusty, dimly lit building that smelled of mildew and old paper. The librarian, a frail woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, seemed reluctant to help me at first. But when I mentioned the whistling man, her demeanor changed. "You've seen him, haven't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, and she sighed, leading me to a section of the library filled with old, leather-bound books. She pulled out a volume titled Folklore and Legends of Black Hollow and handed it to me. "Be careful," she warned. "Some things are better left buried." I took the book back to my cabin and began to read. The chapter on the whistling man was brief but chilling. According to the book, the whistling man was once a real person, a traveling musician who came to Black Hollow in the late 1800s. He was known for his haunting melodies and his ability to charm anyone who heard him play. But there was a darkness in him, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. One night, after a performance at the local tavern, the musician disappeared into the woods. The townsfolk searched for him, but found nothing. A week later, a group of hunters stumbled upon his body, hanging from a tree. His face had been removed, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. From that day on, people began to report hearing whistling in the woods. Those who followed the sound never returned. The legend grew, and over time, the musician became known as the Whistling Man, a malevolent spirit that lured people to their doom. As I read, I felt a chill run down my spine. The description of the Whistling Man matched what I had seen: the tall, gaunt figure, the featureless face, the wide, gaping mouth. But what scared me most was the realization that he wasn't just a legend. He was real. That night, the whistling returned. It was louder and more insistent than ever, as if the Whistling Man knew I was learning about him. I tried to ignore it, burying myself under the covers and covering my ears, but it was no use. The sound seeped into my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and a knife and stepped outside, determined to confront the Whistling Man once and for all. The woods were dark and silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my feet. I followed the whistling, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a clearing. There he was, standing in the center of the clearing, his head tilted to one side as if waiting for me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He began to move, his long limbs jerking unnaturally as he stepped toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The Whistling Man stopped just a few feet away from me, his blank face inches from mine. I could smell the rot on him, the stench of decay that clung to his pale, cracked skin. He opened his mouth, and the whistling grew louder, more intense, until it felt like my head would explode. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whistling stopped. The Whistling Man tilted his head, as if considering me, and then he stepped back. He turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I don't know why he let me go. Maybe he was toying with me, savoring my fear. Or maybe he knew that running would only make the chase more fun. Whatever the reason, I didn't stick around to find out. I ran back to my cabin, packed my things, and left Black Hollow that same night. But the Whistling Man didn't stay behind. I hear him sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet. The whistling is faint, almost inaudible, but it's there, a constant reminder that he's still out there, waiting. I don't know what he wants or why he chose me, but I do know this: he's not done with me yet. And one day, when I least expect it, he'll come for me again.